Then our second reading.
Okay. It's Matthew 26, 57 through 68. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas and the high priest, where the teachers of the law and elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, two came forward and declared, "This fellow said, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under the oath of the living God to tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look now, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? Is he worthy of death?" They answered. Then they spit on his face and struck him with his fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who hit you?"
Thank you, Rhonda. So this week, we continue our series entitled 24 Hours. And it's the last 24 hours or so before Christ's death. And so it's really important for us to recognize what was going on during that time as we're leading up to Easter. Now, in case any of you all didn't know, I like comic books. I've enjoyed them for quite a while, and ever since I was a kid, I collected them. And there's something just very special about superheroes in comic books. And one thing, though, that I think, except for a few exceptions, they all share. They all share one thing pretty much throughout all the comic book fandom. There's one thing they all share. Anybody want to guess what it is? Any thoughts? There's always a hero, but there's something special about every one of the superheroes. They all share pretty much, almost all of them share the same trait. They're all hiding who they really are. Pretty much all of them have a secret identity, right? And so they all have to, they wear a mask, or they hide themselves in some unique way. Maybe you're like Superman and wear glasses and rough up your hair a little bit, and all of a sudden you look different. I always wondered how stupid were his friends. But anyways, moving along, they all were hiding who they were. Well, in this reading, we have Jesus revealing who he really is. Now, of course, he's different from the superhero characters. One, he's real. And two, he never hid who he was. There was no hiding for him in any way, shape, or form. Jesus was who he was, take it or leave it. He never hid it. He'd been around for about 3 years or so, teaching and healing and all sorts of things that it was a way of him showing who he really was. He was the Messiah, the one they had all been waiting for hundreds of years. They had been waiting for the Messiah to save the people from their very sins. Now, in this passage, we see the religious leaders, they're finally clicking. They're finally starting to understand who Jesus says he is. Now, they weren't saying he was who he was, but they were really picking up on what he said he was. So Peter, after fleeing the garden, follows them, and, after some issues and different things that happened there, he finally was kind of sitting in with the Sanhedrin, or at least in the outer court, watching this whole trial go on. Now, the Sanhedrin were kind of a unique group. They were, I guess the simplest way to say it, they were the supreme law of the land of Judea. And they had authority up to the boundaries that the Romans had set for them. So they really had a lot of authority. Their goal or their purpose was to punish everybody they could and not bother the Romans. Basically was what they were trying to do. But there were certain cases that they didn't have authority on. They could not give the death penalty to anybody. They could present a case to the Roman authorities, but they themselves could not give the death penalty to anybody. Well, these guys had a lot of authority. And like a lot of people in authority, they don't like their authority questioned. They don't want to lose the power that they had. And Jesus, he was challenging their authority. He was challenging their right to, quote unquote, rule. He was challenging their power, and they didn't like it. So, we have here, finally, two came forward and declared, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Aren't you going to answer? Aren't you going to say anything?" These guys are basically making a statement against you. Aren't you going to say anything? But Jesus remained silent. You see, the Sanhedrin wanted evidence. They needed to have evidence to prove him wrong, to basically put him on trial for death. Of course, the problem was Jesus was innocent, wasn't he? They didn't like that. But let's be honest, this was not a trial for justice. This was a trial to get Jesus put to death. They wanted to shut him up. That's what this whole trial was about. It had nothing to do with justice whatsoever. They wanted him to shut up. Now, the witness setup is a little bit different in this time period, this situation, than it was in other places. Because we have to remember, it was a different time period. Now, what was interesting is, according to verse 60, there was plenty of witnesses. The problem was, they didn't match up. Everybody was coming forward and saying something. They didn't match. It didn't support each other, in other words. And according to Mosaic law, the laws that Moses wrote, that all of these people were abiding by, you could not put somebody to death. You basically couldn't charge somebody with a crime unless there was at least 2 witnesses. Well, this was the Sanhedrin's problem. There wasn't 2 witnesses stepping forward saying the same thing. And so in their mind, oh my gosh, this guy's going to get off on a technicality. That was their big concern. That was their issue. So finally, these 2 men just show up. I'm sure they were coerced into saying it. I don't think we can argue with that because, of course, what they said was a lie. But these 2 guys show up to share a lie. A lie that Jesus said he was going to destroy God's temple and raise it up in 3 days. He never said that, though, did he? In John, Jesus said, I will destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. The temple he was talking about was himself. And how ironic is it that the Sanhedrin were setting up to destroy that exact temple? And yes, Jesus was coming back in 3 days. They were helping set in motion what had to be done anyways. They were instrumental in helping set it all up. And yet, they were trying to stop it. And by trying to stop it, they just pushed it forward. So then we kind of come to this conversation that kind of hinges everything together. It kind of clicks everything together, brings everything together in one piece. Of course, Jesus knew this was all going to happen. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus says, yes, it is as you say. But I say to you all, in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And then this is where the high priest gets pretty dramatic. Tears his robes and screams blasphemy, which was basically violating God, offending God of the utmost. And of course, all of his buddies are like, oh yeah, he's worthy of death. Oh yeah, you're right, Caiaphas. Absolutely. He's worthy of death. So I think we need to kind of address a few things in this. There was a lot going on in that little situation. First, back in verse 63, the high priest asked Jesus if he was the Christ. Now, some people, if they don't know kind of the history, think, well, duh, his name is Jesus Christ. Of course he's the Christ. Well, we have to remember, Christ wasn't his last name. It wasn't. It was a title. It was the Hebrew word. It's the Greek form of the Hebrew word for Messiah, which means anointed one. He was the anointed one. He was the one everybody was looking forward to seeing. The Messiah, the one that would bring life back to the people. So technically his name was Jesus, or actually Joshua, or Yeshua, but we won't get into that part. But it was really Jesus the Christ. It was a title. It was an acknowledgement of who he really was. Last names were a different situation, a different step for that culture. It didn't mean necessarily the same thing we do. I mean, very often back then, it was usually more in reference to the town you grew up in. Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus, the son of Joseph, or however. Names had a different meaning, but the titles have a significance. And sometimes the titles and the names can be almost the same thing. The belief in Jesus' day was that the Messiah would be kind of this human warrior king that was going to destroy all of the Romans, right? That's what they were looking for. That's what they were building up to. But understand also that their view had been skewed. It had been changed. That's not what the Bible actually said. That's not what Scripture actually said the Messiah was going to be. But we have to remember these people had been overcome by the Roman people. And so they needed something to cling to. So they changed the story. They changed the idea of what they're supposed to be looking for. Yes, their Messiah was coming back as a king, but not in the earthly way. And that's what they were looking for. That's what they wanted, was this warrior king. So if Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, well, wait a second. That's not what we want. I mean, Scripture says, that's what we want. But what we actually want is a warrior, a conqueror. But that's not what Jesus was. And they sure as heck didn't want him to be their Messiah, did he? But, of course, Jesus is like, yeah, that's me. I'm the Messiah. I am the one you've been waiting for. I am the one that God has sent. And what's interesting is he uses the term Son of Man. You see, he used that term, almost that title, throughout Scripture. Throughout his ministry, he uses that term a lot. Now, to us, that doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot. But for a people who had grown up on the Scripture, that term, Son of Man, was huge. Because Scripture uses that multiple times. And in fact, as Rhonda said, we saw it in Daniel, where it said, In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. And it goes on. This is the Messiah. So the term Son of Man was significant. It made a difference. Names mean something. That's where a name really does mean something. That's where that title really means something. It wasn't just something that Jesus pulled out because it sounded cool. It meant something. It was significant. Think about this. If I say Bond, James Bond, we know chaos is going to ensue pretty quickly. Probably some pretty cool little gadgets too. But it's different than if I say Smith, Fred Smith. Doesn't have the ring to it, does it? It doesn't quite roll off the tongue. You're like, all right, nice to meet you, Fred. There's not much to it, right? But names have a tendency to mean something. They bring some history up. Even if you've never seen a James Bond movie, you know what that means, right? Or if I say something like a name like Tubman, Harriet Tubman, we know who that is, right? We know the significance of Harriet Tubman, of the fact that she helped lead the slaves through the Underground Railroad to freedom. Or how about Rockefeller? We think of wealth. It means something. Extravagance. Or if I say something like Hitler, or even Adolf. I mean, you don't hear a whole heck of a lot of young boys running around named Adolf, do you? And what does it have to do with? That gentleman right there. You see, names can very much mean something. Titles can very much mean something. Heck, if I say Presley or Madonna, whether you like them or not, you have to admit there were some significant contributions to music. You see, those names have meaning. They carry weight. Good or bad, they bring things to mind. And so Son of Man was significant to the people at that time. You see, Jesus was saying, I am the Son of Man, sent by God. He was human, but he was more than human. He was fully human, but also fully God. Now you say, I don't understand that. I don't either. But then again, none of us are God. You see, the Son of Man would be given authority over all creation and would be worshipped. And what does Scripture say that the only thing we can worship is? God. And so, for him to say, the Son of Man, and for God to acknowledge that the Son of Man is to be worshipped, that means he is God. You see, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Jesus said those words, showing the significance of his authority and knowing that the term Son of Man meant something. It was not only saying who he was, but also a warning to the Sanhedrin and to the others. They can be judged, and judged harshly. You see, they knew what the Son of Man term meant. That name meant. They knew exactly what he was saying, and it ticked them off. Because this was not only him saying who he was. In their mind, this was an admission of guilt. He was admitting that he said he was the Son of God. They didn't like that. They saw that he was, in their mind, worthy of death. It's kind of easy to blame the Sanhedrin, especially since we have Scripture to look back on. We know how the story ends. We know how it all comes together. But looking at this trial, we have to ask ourselves this question. How do we view Jesus? Is he just another historical figure like Gandhi or Martin Luther King? Is he just a religious figure like Buddha or Muhammad? Well, he's none of them. He's the divine Son of God, the Son of Man, the Messiah. He is God in the flesh. He came to earth as the Messiah to save us. Save us from the very penalties of sin that we brought on ourselves. You see, he laid down his perfect life, his perfect soul, his perfect holy life to take those sins from us. And you say, well, I've never actually seen Jesus. Yeah, we have. We've seen him. May not look the way we thought, but we've seen Jesus in the downtrodden, in the ones that struggle, in the ones that need a hand up. We've seen Jesus. So how do we treat Jesus when we see him? Do we ignore him? Say he's not worthy of our time. I'm busy. I got a schedule to keep. There was a professor that was teaching at this Christian college. And he had scheduled a test. It was the last test of the class. And he said, you fail this test, you fail this class. So, stress, obviously. Stress on these students, big time. So the students get to the classroom and they're sitting in there and waiting. Obviously, all of them got there ahead of time because they did not want to be late, of course. About 5 minutes before class is going to start, the teacher's assistant comes in and said, the professor had to change the venue. We're across campus. You need to get there. If you're late, the door will be locked. All of them. Book it. There's almost knocking down of each other. As they get there, they get to the door, and the professor sees all these students coming in. And, they're sweating, and, they look like they've just been beaten. They're just having a rough time of it. The professor is standing there, and he says, what is the title of this class? And I said, well, it's Christian Morals. He said, what does that mean? And of course, there's a number of different responses. And of course, all of them have to be using as many $10 words as they can, right? Because they want to impress the professor. And he says, I don't care about any of that. How many of you saw that panhandler about halfway across campus? How many of you helped him? Not a single one did. He said, you all failed. Now, how tough is it? Can you imagine? But isn't that the idea? God puts people in our place, in our way sometimes, that he calls us to help. It's up to us whether or not we see Jesus in them. It's tough. It's tough because the Sanhedrin, this was not the Messiah they were looking for. He didn't look like him. He didn't act like them. He was not the Messiah they wanted to see. How many of us want to see Jesus? And yet we have the opportunity every day to see Jesus. And we have a tendency to overlook him. It's tough. I have done it. I won't tell you of all the times I've done it, but I've done it myself. I'm not saying I'm proud of it. In fact, I'm ashamed of it. But we all do it. So we need to recognize The king that we're looking for, he's not going to look like what we think. He's not going to talk like what we think he's going to talk like. Maybe not even smell like we think he's going to smell. But just like the Sanhedrin, we have a tendency to overlook our king, the Messiah, the one that is here to bring us saving grace. He wants all of us to see him.